Cecil, leader of the Red Wings, is tasked by the King of Baron to steal the world's crystals. After questioning the king's motives, he is stripped of his rank and ordered to deliver a package to a nearby town. After he reaches his destination, the package is opened and it destroys the village. Left alone in the aftermath, Cecil must find his way back to Baron to find out the reason for the king's change of heart and discover the mystery of the crystals. Final Fantasy IV is notable for being the first game in the Final Fantasy series to have the active time battle system. This means characters take their turns when their action bar fills up, instead of every party member's turn being decided at the same time, then waiting for it all to resolve to issue another set of commands. It's a positive change that makes fights more engaging. You're more actively invested in battles, especially if you're on active versus wait mode. The faster you do your character's turns, the faster they get back in queue to have another turn. The rewards may be slight, but the ATB system does incentivize quick decisions. Unfortunately, you never have party choices in Final Fantasy IV. They also don't have the job system from previous games. Characters do fall into the job archetypes, and you're given party members with unique abilities who come and go throughout the adventure, until you have your final party. Every character is a one-trick pony. Each character's unique ability is either underpowered and rarely used, or overpowered and used every turn. The magic casters aren't necessarily unique, as there is a lot of overlap between white and black magic users. Unique abilities like Kick and Peek aren't particularly useful in most circumstances, whereas other abilities like Twin and Jump are much more useful and used all the time. Having an assigned party means boss encounters can be designed around your mandatory party setup. This sounds really appealing, but unfortunately, this means a lot of the mechanics are incredibly shallow, as characters' unique abilities aren't particularly interesting to use. Anytime there's a specific requirement for a boss encounter, you're explicitly told over and over what to do. Against Barbaricia, you're told Kain needs to jump every single time you attack her while she's spinning. It often doesn't even change the way you'd fight a battle, since you'd be doing these things anyways, as they're clearly the most effective strategies. Otherwise, Final Fantasy IV is very typical RPG fare. You travel around the world, fighting random battles, getting vehicles like airships and hovercrafts, doing story battles, try to figure out what's going on, get betrayed one too many times, and eventually the big bad reveals himself, and you take him down. As the first Final Fantasy on the Super Nintendo, Final Fantasy IV has notable improvements to its graphical and sound quality. The sprites are more detailed than the NES releases, but there is clear influence from them. The graphical improvements make it easy to make out what things are, and especially the environments and in-battle backgrounds are just a lot better. They're more diverse and much more detailed. The sound quality is also just higher. There are a good number of familiar tracks and fanfare, but things are good across the board. It's quite similar to the NES games, as it is a bit archaic. It's the little things like your inventory doesn't auto-sort. Fortunately, you can buy items in lots of 10 now, but they don't automatically stack. Buying 10, then 10, then 10 each take up their own inventory space until you decide to manually sort them, which is kind of annoying. The story isn't particularly interesting. It falls into a bad trap of contrived twists. It keeps moving the goalposts and doesn't feel like it's earned the right to do so. You're getting into something pretty juicy, and then you're thrown in a different direction where suddenly you have a new villain. There are quite a few memorable parts of the story, such as Tella's classic "You Spoony Bard" and Cecil's redemption arc. These moments elevate the experience, but for the most part, it's quite generic fantasy and just not really worth getting invested in. Final Fantasy IV has a reasonable difficulty curve for most of the game. As long as you fight battles as they come, rarely run, and exploit obvious weaknesses, you will have virtually zero issues progressing. That is until you get to a few areas, mostly related to the Tower of Babel, and the return to it later. Despite that, some fights are deceptively easy. Bosses like Cagnazzo can be killed with virtually one casting of Tella's Lit 3 at the right time. Certain bosses are also vulnerable to spells like Weak, which reduce their hit points to single digits. Exploitation like this is cool, but when it's a fairly hyped up story battle, it feels inappropriate to basically one-shot the boss. But then you have a few fights that are just totally out of your hands. In the scripted scene with Golbez after Calcabrena, it's very easy to die. If you're lucky, you can get a jump off with Cain to make it a bit easier, but it feels like it's a total crapshoot otherwise. Multiple attempts were required to get through it, which requires fighting Calcabrena multiple times. This was just awful, and felt totally luck-based whether or not you even had the potential to succeed. This is true for a lot of the optional encounters as well. If you're unprepared and more likely underleveled, you're probably just gonna die. Most of these optional areas are made significantly easier by spells like Float and Reflect. These are high-level white magic from Rosa. It's unlikely that you'll be high enough level to have access to these spells when these encounters are first available, unless you grind in excess. These harder boss battles are optional, but are worthwhile to complete for access to the powerful equipment and summons you gain from them. As with all JRPGs, grinding and character levels will dictate the difficulty of most encounters. At lower levels, fights require a lot of understanding of mechanics and a bit of luck to succeed, while at higher levels, you can often just steamroll encounters through brute force. You don't have many meaningful choices to make in combat or pre-combat with your gear loadouts, so really levels play more of a factor in the difficulty than they probably should. Despite a decent amount of grinding, and doing most of the optional content with the exception of the Sylvan Cave, Final Fantasy IV was completed in 14 hours, 3 minutes, and 25 seconds. It starts off with surprisingly decent pacing. After getting Rydia initially, there were about 10 minutes of fighting random battles to get her into a position where she wasn't immediately killed by most enemies. Afterwards, things progressed very smoothly. After entering the underworld and beating Calcabrena and Golbez, 40 minutes were spent leveling up in preparation for the Tower of Babel. Then things were smooth sailing until the moon, where enemies' difficulty spiked again and time was needed to tune up. An hour was spent on arrival here, and another hour was spent at the final save point to be able to survive the last boss's big attacks. Rough estimations are about 3 to 4 hours of just grinding to have a reasonable time in Final Fantasy IV. Just for fun and interest, a glitch was used to bypass the entirety of the sealed cave by using warp after the fight with Golbez to get the Dark Crystal early. Rough estimations would be skipping the sealed cave saves about 30 minutes and avoids a potentially difficult boss fight. This may also have had implications on the grinding required, as a portion of the game was skipped. For JRPGs, recommended playing values player agency and story. This usually comes as character customization or otherwise having some semblance of influence or choices through the course of the battles through character abilities and actions. Final Fantasy IV simply does not have that in any real capacity. You're never given options and party choices. Battle mechanics are simple, but told to you, the player, in every fight that requires them. Even if they weren't explicitly told, they are the optimum turns for these characters and it would be obvious. The story just isn't that interesting, outside of some very iconic moments. Final Fantasy IV is a classic, and is one of the fan favorites of the series. When I was growing up, I loved this game. It was my favorite Final Fantasy. When you take a step back and look past the nostalgia, you can see some really obvious cracks. This isn't an easy verdict to deliver, but recommended playing isn't a popularity contest. It would be super easy to throw this game a recommendation based on popular opinion alone. Final Fantasy IV isn't a bad game, and it's a totally reasonable and enjoyable playthrough if you like classic JRPGs. It's definitely worth looking at for being such an iconic game, but if you're not an RPG aficionado or couldn't care less about playing every iteration of Final Fantasy, then Final Fantasy IV on the Super Nintendo is safe to skip. Final Fantasy IV gets recommended playing's most disgraceful verdict of not recommended.